Today we bring you a powerful conversation with Dr. SHASHI Tharoor, a renowned Indian politician, author, and former diplomat. At the Healy Forum 2024, Dr. Tharoor speaks on the topics of opportunity or chaos, the new world disorder diving into the global challenges presented by the rise of China, geopolitical shifts, and the backlash against globalization. Through his insightful analysis, Dr. Tharoor sheds light on how nations can navigate these disruptions to create new opportunity for cooperation and growth.
During the recent years, especially the last months, we've really witnessed an unprecedented convergence of crises. Political tensions, wars, economical instability, health pandemic also a few years ago, and the growing, of course, impact of the climate change, which is very important for the world and this planet. Countries, nations, institutions, individuals are facing a challenge that tests their resilience, our resilience actually, and vision for the future. However, I like this, however, history often shows that chaos can also be a breeding ground for innovation, transformation, and new opportunities. Today, in this, of course, session, we will explore how the current global turmoil might not only be a source of concern for all of us, but a catalyst for a positive change. Thank you for being with us. I will start with you, Your Excellency, Dr. Shashi. How do you define the current state of the global turmoil?
You know, we had a period when the Cold War bipolarity gave way to two overlapping and by and large seen as positive developments. Globalization, spreading around the world, knitting us together economically, technologically, and so on. And of course, from 1990, with the end of the Cold War, the unipolar moment when the US seemed to be in really a position of dominance technologically, economically, militarily, politically. Now, this has suddenly been challenged with four developments I'd like to identify briefly. The first is the backlash against globalization, which gathered pace. It had two components, economic and cultural. The economic backlash was people in the developed countries saying, why are we voting for governments that are sending our jobs off to China and India? And I think there was a cultural backlash as well against the cosmopolitanism that came with globalization. Davos man flitting around the globe, the migrants who were coming into different countries. And that cultural backlash has been described very effectively as a clash between the somewheres and the anywheres. Anywheres being people like us here who can speak anywhere in the world, and the somewheres being those anchored in one country, one religion, one language, one place. So that's the first major trend. The second, I would say, was the end of the peaceful rise of China, which took place during that period of globalization. China becoming more assertive, more effective, and challenging the US dominance in all these areas, political, economic, technological, military. Third, and this is where Carl, I'm sure, will have a lot more to say, is Europe. Europe, I remember Carl telling me a few years ago, there's an arc of crisis from the Nile to the Indus. Well, it's gone well beyond the Nile now. Ukraine has dragged Europe into this arc of crisis. And I think there is a certain European ambivalence as well about where they fit into all of this. Ambivalence over Ukraine, ambivalence over China, and of course Russia right on their doorstep. And the fourth and final trend I see is the emergence of new theaters of international cooperation in response to all this. You've got the talk about the Indo-Pacific for the first time. We've got the references to the rise of the rest, which is now being talked about as the global south, which is seeking to be both non-West without being anti-West, and expressing its ambitions in different ways. I mean, it's a cliche that in world affairs you're either at the table or on the menu.
Oh, yeah.
And if you don't want to be on the menu, you have to find ways of expressing your opportunities at the high table. So they're also trying to do this, and this is manifesting itself in multiple ways we can talk about: plurilateral arrangements, new groupings, and
amazing
also
overview for the situation that could have led to this turbulence. So, backlash, globalization, cultural and economical, China, Europe, and the new emerging countries. Dr. Shashi, here you mentioned China. As we witness shifting power dynamic during the last decades or the last 20 years between East and West, what impact do you believe this rivalry in having on global stability and cooperation? And you mentioned it, it's mainly China and America.
Well, I mean, China is definitely now emerging as a new hegemon, a new significant, whether you want to call it superpower or whatever, a challenge to the U.S. At the same time, the Chinese and the Americans have levels of cooperation and interdependence that never existed during the Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. You've got more Chinese investments in U.S. Treasury bonds. You've got more American investments in the Chinese economy. You've got Chinese students in America. You've got American tourists in China. All of these things didn't happen during the Cold War. So it's not quite the same thing, but there are a number of concerns. China's become much more assertive on its borders, maritime as well as land with us in India, where we've had a very unpleasant incident that ended 44 years of a peaceful coexistence on our otherwise disputed frontier. We've had incidents in the South China Sea with the Japanese, with the Philippines, with Vietnam. So it's a different China from what we had got used to in the earlier days.
And the high-tech, powerful advance
right. They're advancing
of China.
remarkably in high-tech, solar, they're world leaders. 5G, they're perhaps ahead of America, we're not entirely sure, but there's an
5G,
awful lot of progress happening. So technologically, they're doing well. Militarily, they've almost caught up. The Chinese Navy is almost as well equipped as the American Navy now. They've got more planes, more soldiers, obviously. And as far as the economy is concerned, they have already supplanted the U.S. as a manufacturing power, as an industrial power, and they will overtake the
and they
U.S.
are
economy.
eating this, between the first powerful country, that is the U.S., they are coming second economically, and they are grabbing in the scales to more and more be closer to America, which they don't like it. What are the alliances? We talk about alliances EU. We have BRICS that was joined by UAE, for example, Egypt and Saudi Arabia, for example. We have NATO is an alliance. We have ASEAN is an alliance. I'm talking about economic blocks and, of course, military blocks as well. What are they from all those
guys? There's a proliferation of such groupings. The Americans, of course, still rely heavily on NATO. And what's interesting is the Russian invasion of Ukraine has resulted in Sweden, Carl's own Sweden, and Finland joining NATO, which was never on the cards until the Russians invaded Ukraine.
But it's okay to say for now, because if Trump is coming, NATO will not be really in a good position?
Well, we'll have to see. But it's not just NATO. What Americans are doing is creating smaller groupings, mini-lateral groupings everywhere. So where countries are not willing to be allies in the formal sense, like India, They've created partnerships. There's a group called the Quad, which is US, Japan, Australia, India.
True.
There's another group called the Squad, where it's the Philippines instead of India. There's the Australia, US, UK, or AUKUS, which is now a military alliance because all three are formally allied. And you've got all of these different things happening to try and shore up the effort of the Americans to match economic decoupling from China on the one hand with a geopolitical and military containment of China. So that's interesting. China, on the other hand, has no allies. Show me a Chinese ally. There isn't an ally. They have dependencies.
How?
They have countries that are dependent on them. And with America,
They are soft power in Africa, Dr. Shashi. How is that? They have a lot of African countries. They are allies because they build, they invest.
They're not alliances, they're dependencies. So they are given an awful amount of aid, and those countries are suitably grateful. But the fact is, these are not countries that they can use in a geopolitical conflict or a standoff. Linked to that is the fact of the whole big question mark over the Chinese-Russian partnership. You remember just before the Ukraine war started, Mr. Putin visited Beijing and there was this announcement of a no-limits partnership. Well, some of the limits are already becoming apparent in terms of how far the Chinese can go to support the Russians. Now, on top of that, you've got this question of the fact that Russia, on the one hand, is more and more dependent on China, economically, trade, in terms of sanctions, military, and so on. But at the same time, they have relations with countries that are not so happy with China, including India and Vietnam.
My question now, do you see an opportunity for cooperation between those alliances to be part of the conflict resolutions in many parts of the world?
Well, for the sake of the world, I hope so, because obviously we're not sitting here saying we're all doomed into an inevitable conflict. But those opportunities would require some very, very serious and imaginative rethinking, both of global structures, which frankly, the United Nations was created after 2 world wars, a Holocaust, Hiroshima. You're not going to get that kind, God willing, we're not going to get that kind of crisis. So we need, even in times of relative peace and calm, to find the global imagination to be able to redesign global systems, accommodate different voices, give the global south more of a voice, give the Chinese a place that is respectable without allowing them to dominate, give countries like India, Africa, and others their own place of honor. All of that is one thing that needs to be done. Secondly, we need to move away from the risk of greater bipolarity. We need to go, for example, away from this language of containment, which is very rife in Washington even today, into something more like constraining rather than containing. Limiting how much damage any one country can do to its neighbors and others. And maybe instead of decoupling, we should be talking about multiplying our relationships economically as well as politically, rather than actually ending any relationships. But this will require multiple efforts by various countries across the world.
Thank you very much for attending. Thank you so much.
Visit our site, EnglishSpeechChannel.com, for exclusive access to video transcripts, offline audio, English lessons, and private classes. Don't forget to explore our free and new ebooks. Also, subscribe to our weekly newsletter for the latest updates. Links in the description below. Thanks for your support.